This deep dive is going to help you understand one of the most important concepts you'll need to know.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We're talking about ecological succession.
That's right.
And I know it can seem a little intimidating at first, but trust me, once we break it down, you'll be able to ace those questions on the exam.
Exactly.
So let's jump right in. And you know those diagrams in your textbook
Yeah.
with the bare rock turning into a forest over time?
Right?
Well, that's succession in a nutshell. It's basically how an ecosystem changes over time.
Yeah, it's like watching a community evolve right in front of you.
Exactly. So to make things super clear, we're going to focus on two main types of succession today.
Okay.
Terrestrial
Happens on land,
and aquatic.
which of course happens in water.
But let's start with terrestrial succession because I think it's the easiest to visualize.
Yeah, most people are more familiar with it too.
Right. So within terrestrial succession, we have two main categories.
Primary and secondary.
Primary succession is like the ultimate starting from scratch scenario.
Think brand new land.
Like after a volcanic eruption where you have just bare rock, no soil, nothing.
Soil, that's key.
And this is where those tough little pioneers come in, like lichens and mosses.
Got it. Those are the ones that can handle the harsh conditions.
I'm looking at a diagram right now, and it shows these lichens clinging to a rock.
Yeah, they're amazing.
But how do they actually create soil? It's not like they're carrying little shovels and buckets, are they?
Definitely not. They actually produce acids that slowly break down the rock.
So they're like tiny little rock-eating machines.
Pretty much. And
Yeah.
then when they die, their organic matter mixes with those rock fragments. And over time,
Boom, you've got soil.
exactly, it's
Yeah.
a slow process, but
Right.
it's the foundation for everything that comes after.
So after the lichens and mosses do their thing, what happens next?
Well, once you have a thin layer of soil,
Like even just a little bit.
yeah, then some other species can start to move in like grasses and ferns.
I see. And their roots help to break down the rock even more.
Exactly, and add more organic matter to the soil. So then it gets thicker and richer, and then you start to see shrubs and maybe even some small trees popping up.
So it's like this gradual buildup each stage, creating the conditions for the next,
Exactly.
until eventually you get a forest.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it, how life can take hold in even the most barren places.
It really is.
But it's not always a perfectly predictable sequence, right?
You got it. It depends on things like the climate,
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
the type of rock that's there,
Mm.
and even just random chance like which seeds happen to blow in on the wind.
So it's not like there's a set recipe that every ecosystem follows.
Nope. Every place is unique.
Okay, so that's primary succession, starting from scratch with just bare rock.
Right.
But what about secondary succession? How is that different?
Well, secondary succession happens after a disturbance like a forest fire or a flood.
Okay, so there's already soil there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the key difference because it means things can recover much faster. I see. So instead of starting from bare rock, you already have a foundation to build on.
Exactly. And a lot of times there are seeds and roots that survived the disturbance.
Oh, right. So they can just start growing again.
Exactly. So you might see new shoots popping up from those surviving roots,
That's
or seeds that were dormant in the soil suddenly have the space and light they need to germinate.
So secondary succession is like hitting the reset button on an ecosystem?
Sort of, but it's not a complete reset because the soil's still there.
Right. So it's more like fast forwarding through the early stages of primary succession.
Exactly.
So if a forest burns down in a fire, will it always grow back to be exactly the same as it was before?
Not necessarily. The species composition might change a little bit.
Why is that?
Well, some species might be better adapted to those post-fire conditions.
Like they can tolerate the heat or the smoke.
Right, while other species might struggle to reestablish themselves.
This is like a shakeup that can create opportunities for different species to take hold.
Exactly. And that can actually increase biodiversity in the long run.
That's interesting. So both primary and secondary succession lead to changes in the ecosystem over time. But is there an endpoint? Do ecosystems eventually reach a stable state?
Well, that's where the idea of a climax community comes in.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
It's basically that mature, relatively stable stage of an ecosystem.
So it's like the grand finale of succession, the endpoint of all those changes.
Well, not quite. It's more like a dynamic equilibrium.
Dynamic equilibrium. Okay, now you're just using fancy words to confuse me.
Sorry, let me explain. Even in a climax community, there's still change happening. Trees die, new ones grow, populations fluctuate.
Okay.
But the overall structure and composition of the ecosystem remain relatively stable over time.
So it's like a well-choreographed dance with different species coming and going,
Yeah,
but the overall rhythm stays the same. I
exactly.
like that analogy.
And keep in mind that the concept of a climax community is a bit idealized.
In what way?
Well, in reality, ecosystems are constantly being influenced by factors like climate change, human activities, and natural disturbances.
Right. Like that forest fire we talked about earlier.
Right.
It can kind of reset the successional clock even in a mature ecosystem.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point. Human activities can significantly impact succession.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Think about deforestation,
Uh,
agriculture, or urbanization.
Wait, we're constantly changing the landscape.
Exactly. And these activities can alter the natural course of succession, sometimes preventing ecosystems from reaching a climax stage.
So it's like we're throwing a wrench into the natural processes.
Kind of.
Makes sense considering all the environmental challenges we're facing today.
Absolutely. Understanding succession helps us grasp how ecosystems respond to disturbances, both natural and human caused.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with terrestrial succession.
Hmm.
Now let's shift gears and dive into aquatic succession. Our notes mention that it happens in water too,
It does.
but I'm having a little trouble picturing it. Is it similar to what happens on land?
In many ways, yes. The basic principles are the same: gradual change in species and structure over time.
Okay, so the players are different, but the game is still the same.
Pretty much. But the timescale can vary greatly.
So it could happen faster or slower depending on the environment.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's imagine a scenario. Let's say there's a shallow lake that starts filling up with sediment. What happens next?
Well, as the lake gets shallower,
Okay.
submerged plants start to thrive. They trap more sediment, which actually accelerates the process.
I see. So the plants were helping to fill in the lake
Exactly. And over time, the lake might turn into a marsh.
with those tall grasses and stuff.
Right, like cattails and reeds. And eventually, the marsh might even dry out completely, becoming a terrestrial ecosystem.
Whoa. So a lake can literally transform into a forest. That's amazing.
It is. And it highlights how interconnected these systems are. Aquatic succession often influences terrestrial ecosystems and vice versa.
Okay, my brain is starting to make these connections. Now let's zoom in on a specific type of aquatic succession that I know is often tested on the AP exam.
Tide pools.
Yes, tide pool succession. I'm looking at a diagram of a tide pool right now.
Okay, what do you see?
It shows all sorts of organisms. Algae barnacles, mussels, sea stars. How does succession play out in this tiny world?
Well, imagine a wave dislodging a rock, creating a bare patch. That's your starting point. Algae are usually the first colonizers, forming a slippery film on the rock.
So algae are like the lichens of the tide pool world.
Exactly. Then come the barnacles, those little crustaceans that cement themselves to the rock. They can tolerate exposure to air and waves, which makes them well suited for that harsh environment.
But how do they get there? Do they just float around until they find an empty spot?
Barnacle larvae are actually free swimming.
Really?
Yeah, they drift in the water until they find a suitable surface to attach to.
That's wild. It's like they're searching for their own little piece of real estate.
You could say that. And as they grow and die, they create more surface area and crevices for other organisms to colonize.
So the tide pool is becoming more complex with different species interacting and creating habitats for each other. But where do the sea stars fit into this picture?
Sea stars are predators. They feed on mussels and other invertebrates.
Okay, so they're like the top dogs of the tide pool food web.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Sea stars are a classic example of a keystone species.
Yes, species. That's a term I see all the time in my APS notes.
Yeah, it's an important one.
But can you explain why sea stars are so important?
Well, by preying on mussels, sea stars prevent them from dominating the tide pool and outcompeting other species.
So they keep things in balance.
Exactly. If sea stars are removed, the mussel population can explode, crowding out other organisms and reducing the overall diversity of the tide pool.
Whoa. So a single species can have a ripple effect throughout the entire ecosystem.
It really can. That's why they're called keystone species. They're like the keystone in an arch holding everything together.
Okay, that makes sense. And it highlights the importance of understanding ecological relationships and how everything is connected. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground so far. Terrestrial succession, aquatic succession, and keystone species. Now, let's talk about another important concept for the AP exam, indicator species.
Oh, yeah, those are like the canaries in the coal mine of ecosystems.
Okay, I like that analogy.
They're sensitive to environmental changes, so their presence or absence can tell us a lot about the health of an ecosystem.
So they're like living alarm bells alerting us to potential problems.
Exactly. And different indicator species are sensitive to different types of environmental stressors. For example, lichens are often used as indicators of air quality.
Why lichens? What makes them so sensitive to air pollution?
Well, lichens don't have roots,
Oh, right. I remember learning that.
so they absorb nutrients and water directly from the air,
Makes sense.
which makes them super vulnerable to airborne pollutants like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides.
So if you see a decline in lichen diversity or abundance, it could be a sign that air pollution is getting worse.
Exactly. And different lichen species have different tolerances to pollution. So by studying the types of lichens present in an area, scientists can get a pretty good idea of the air quality.
Wow, it's like they're providing us with a real-time assessment of the environment.
You got it.
Are there other examples of indicator species that we should know for the AP exam?
Absolutely. Amphibians are often used as indicators of water quality and habitat health.
Why amphibians?
They have permeable skin, which makes them sensitive to pollutants in both water and air.
Right. I remember reading that amphibian populations are declining worldwide, which is a major concern.
It is. It can be caused by a complex interplay of factors, including habitat loss, pollution, climate change, and disease.
So by monitoring amphibian populations, scientists can track these environmental changes and assess their impact.
Exactly.
Wow. Indicator species are like these valuable sentinels, providing us with insights into the health of our planet.
They really are. And they highlight the importance of conservation efforts. Protecting indicator species can help safeguard entire ecosystems.
That's a powerful message. This is all incredibly helpful. I feel like I'm starting to see the bigger picture, how succession shapes ecosystems, how keystone species maintain balance, and how indicator species alert us to environmental changes.
It's all connected.
It is. And that's what makes environmental science so fascinating.
It really is. It's about understanding the intricate web of life and how all these pieces fit together.
Before we wrap up, can we circle back to those impacts of succession on species richness, biomass, and productivity?
Sure.
I know these are important concepts for the AP East exam, but I'm still a bit fuzzy on the details.
Okay, think of it this way. As an ecosystem goes through succession, it's like watching a play unfold on a grand stage.
Okay, I like that analogy.
The actors are the different species, and the script is the process of ecological change.
So how do species richness, biomass, and productivity change as the play progresses?
Well, in the early stages of succession, the stage is relatively empty. Lots of open niches, plenty of resources, and little competition. This means that species richness, the number of different species, tends to be low at first, but it increases rapidly as new species arrive.
So it's like the opening act with a few key players setting the scene.
Exactly. And as more species arrive, the total amount of living matter in the ecosystem, what we call biomass, also increases.
So more species, more biomass, it's all building up. What about productivity?
Right. That's the rate at which the ecosystem is producing organic matter.
So it's like the energy and activity level of the play?
Yeah, you could say that in early succession, productivity tends to be high because there's less competition and resources are plentiful.
Okay, so everything is booming in those early stages.
It is.
Lots of new species, increasing biomass and high productivity. But what happens as the ecosystem matures?
Well, as the play progresses, the stage gets more crowded. Competition increases, and some species might start to dominate, outcompeting others. This can lead to a slight decrease in species richness, but the overall ecosystem becomes more stable and resilient.
Got it. So it's like the play settling into a more complex storyline.
Exactly. And as the ecosystem reaches a climax stage, biomass often reaches its peak. The stage is full of actors, but the overall growth rate slows down because resources are more limited.
Okay, so biomass is high, but productivity might level off or even slightly decrease.
Right. It's like the play reaching a more steady and sustained pace. The energy level might not be as high as the explosive opening act, but the performance is more intricate.
I'm really liking this analogy. It makes these abstract concepts much easier to understand.
Glad to hear it. And remember, these patterns can vary depending on the type of ecosystem and the specific conditions.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario.
Exactly. That's what makes studying ecology so challenging and rewarding.
So to wrap things up, let's just quickly recap the key takeaways for our listeners who are studying for the AP SIS exam.
Sounds good.
First, make sure you understand the difference between primary and secondary succession.
Primary starts from scratch with bare rock, while secondary occurs in areas where soil already exists.
Right. And remember those impacts of succession on species, richness, biomass, and productivity.
They all change over time as the ecosystem evolves.
And then there are those keystone and indicator species. Be able to explain their roles and give some examples.
Like sea stars and lichens.
Exactly. Those are bound to show up on the exam.
You bet.
All right, that's it for today's deep dive into ecological succession. Thanks for joining us, and good luck with your study.
Yeah, keep exploring and keep asking questions.